Unit 7, Chapter 24, Hellenistic Religion by David Potter. Subchapter 1, Religion. In thinking about the subject of Hellenistic religion, two problems are immediately obvious. The first being the parameters allowed to the concept of a religion, the second being whether or not the adjective makes any sense in conjunction with the noun. In the first case, I will argue that the subject must be permitted to encompass a very broad range of human behaviors conditioned by the belief that powerful divinities controlled every feature of human existence from the moment of conception to the moment of death and beyond. These behaviors include, but are not restricted to, the actions associated with the formal worship of the gods. In recent years, important work on other religious systems has called into question the distinction that has often been employed since the Reformation to distinguish between true and false worship, or between religion and magic. The thrust of this work has been to show that forms of behavior that have been relegated to the category of magic are better seen as alternative forms of religious behavior. I think that this view is the correct one, and I have argued elsewhere that a distinction may usefully be drawn between active and passive forms of religious behavior. By active, I mean behaviors that seek new knowledge of the divine world, or to control divine action. By passive, I mean behaviors sanctioned by tradition that seek to describe the relationship between the mortals and divinities. These actions are passive because they imply an acceptance of existing guidelines. The two modes of religious behavior are complementary, as discoveries made through active investigation serve to reform, reshape, and update traditional behaviors, enabling a religious system to progress as the culture that supports it progresses. So crucial is the interaction between active and passive behaviors that ways of seeking new information were an integral part of sacrifice, the central act of Greek cult. The gods were thought to have decreed the form of sacrifice, were invited to participate in the sacrificial meal, and to indicate their approval or disapproval of the person offering the sacrifice. The question whether or not the adjective Hellenistic can properly be transferred from the context of political history to that of religion has recently become problematic. Important work on the cult system of Athens in particular has drawn attention to large areas of continuity, making it hard to isolate elements of religious behavior that are genuinely new in this period. This is quite correct, but as I will suggest, concentration on civic cult in the traditional Greek homeland tells only one part of the story. The central questions facing the study of Hellenistic religion must then be linked with the broader evolution of societies between the death of Alexander and the rise of both the Roman and Parthian states. One of these must be whether or not the changed horizons of the Greek world altered the way that people saw their relationship with the divine, or whether what appears perhaps most strikingly new can be linked primarily or solely to behaviors that were already current within the pre-existing polis structure. A second question is whether the emergence of supra-regional Greek states affected the practice of cult in the individual cities of the Aegean homeland in other ways, and if so, to what degree? Finally, there is a question of the relationship between the polis religion of the Greek Aegean and the religious systems of the Near East. Should the redefinition of the relationship between the Mesopotamian world and the Mediterranean world that is characteristic of the political history of this period be reasonably allowed some role in conditioning attitudes towards the divine? Perhaps the most significant feature of this period is the interaction between the points of continuity and areas where new forms of conduct involved, or to return to my earlier point, the interaction between active and passive aspects of a religion that resulted from the transformation of the power structure of the vastly expanded Greek world. Subchapter 2, Continuity. The main form of political organization among the Greeks at the end of the period under consideration was, as it had been for the previous 400 years, the polis. Within the polis, the basic structures of religious organization and theory remained largely unchanged. Prices at which priesthoods were sold might vary, but priesthoods were still sold to the highest bidder in the majority of Greek cities. Priests still served male divinities, and priestesses were usually charged with the oversight of female divinities. Where this division by gender was not observed, it was usually a sign that the cult in question was of non-Greek origin. With regard to the cults celebrated in each polis, the issue of ritual purity was of the foremost importance. Only a person who was hagnos, or pure, could approach the gods. The requirement that a person be ritually pure in order to address the divinities is significant in a number of ways. On a very basic level, it helps explain the emphasis of physical action in laws governing cult activity, including the terms under which a person who was not hagnos could become so. Thus, in a law concerning who might make a sacrifice from the city of Metropolis in Ionia, it is stated that he will be hagnos 12 days after the death of a kinsman, 2 days after having had sex with his wife, 3 days after having had sex with a prostitute. In a law from Ionia, datable to 147 to 6 BC, it is stated, he will be hagnos on the 5th day after the death of a kinsman of his own blood. Of another, on the 3rd day after sex with his wife, he may enter on the same day having been cleansed in the designated place in the metron. After sex with a prostitute, he may be cleaned in the same way on the 3rd day. The terms of these laws, which are ubiquitous from the end of the 6th century BC well into the years of Roman domination, reflect a fundamental division between the human and divine spheres. The ease with which everyday acts of purification can be performed reflects a sense that fundamental aspects of the human life cycle result in pollution. This in turn reflects a view that the world is an essential source of corruption, while the realm of the gods is seen as being pure. If one wished to contact the gods in their hereon, the earthly sanctuary that was devoted to their use and thus infused with the awe that one should feel when approaching the divine, one had to attempt to remove impurity from oneself. To do otherwise would be to injure the gods. If the gods were injured, they would take vengeance upon the mortal who offended them. That person would become accursed. Anagus. The negative definition of persons who were not hagnos reflects a sense of the human propensity to fall away from the condition in which they might rightfully contact the gods. It may also be connected with the Greek sense of the gods as anthropomorphic being, as the bodies of the gods were pure, the bodies of humans were not, a reflection of the necessary tension between the darkness in which the visible human body is steeped and the radiant light with which the god's body shines. While the Greeks often used myth to explain why a god was worshipped, the governing body of each cult made the rules for their own cult. Myths might be invented, remembered, or adapted to explain why a cult worked in a certain way, but there was no direct link between the universalizing text of the archaic periods such as Hesiod's theogony and works and days, or the Homeric cycle, and individual Greek cults. Indeed, the practice may be seen as being akin to the terms of the laws quoted above. While they all agree that sex or contact with death brings pollution, they all differ somewhat in describing the way that the pollution needed to be removed. These differences did not occur on a simple polis-to-polis basis, but within a polis on a cult-by-cult basis. Thus, a law from Pergamon states that a man who wished to sleep in the temple of the god Asclepios had to abstain from sex with his wife for 10 days. It may be that as sleeping in the temple involved closer contact with the god, so the level of purification had to be greater. Pollution was not ordinarily in and of itself seen as a moral fault. The closest that Greek thought came to a sense that moral turpitude should keep a person from approaching the god appears in some texts that state that a person must approach with a pure mind as well as a pure body, but this too leaves it up to the individual to ensure that he or she is doing the right thing. It is only a crime if one does not, and the category of crime is separate from that of simple pollution. The same law from Pergamon includes a second category of persons who wish to be freed from a crime. Miasma that arose from physical acts of violence was entirely a different matter, though again it is linked with the notion of touching something that was impure. In the case of murder, the blood of the victim was thought to cling to the hand of the murderer, who had to be excluded from all contact with society. The presence of such a person in a city threatened all who lived there, as it was thought that the spirit of the victim or of avenging deities could affect all who came into contact with the killer. In the end, of course, the gods would exact their revenge, but it was best if humans could speed the process up. The notion that divine revenge could affect a large number of people was deeply imbued in the Greek consciousness, for no person could be innocent if that person did not take a proactive role in stamping out pollution. So too did the notion that the gods were ultimately involved in avenging crimes. A human could evade civic justice systems if he or she sought protection from a god, the situation envisioned in clauses of sacred laws such as that from Pergamon. A criminal could approach the god as a suppliant, Hecates, and obtain purification for his or her crime. The temples of the gods were places where the agents of human justice could not penetrate, all of them having some area surrounding the altar that had a cilia, or sanctuary. The Hecates remained within the temple until he or she received the desired purification. The connection between city and divinity was demonstrated by civic efforts to eliminate sources of pollution, and in a more positive way by annual festivals to the gods and the dedication of things that were precious to a divinity, making the temple a reserved treasury for the city as befitted the house of a wealthy resident. Most crucially, the link between the god and the civic order was represented by the fact that a priest or priestess of a divinity was a civic official. Priesthoods served to link secular society to the shrines of the gods within the city. As we have seen, the land that was attached to a shrine belonged to the god. The priest or priestess did not. They were holders of positions that, in the case of civic cults, belonged to the city. As a city's representative to a shrine, a priest or priestess was obviously an important person, but they were not religious leaders in anything like the modern sense of the word. They did not propound doctrines about the gods as a result of their holding office. They did not preach the gospel of their God, and they did not set the rules of engagement between the community and the divinity. They were there to make sure that the rules were enforced and to manage the bureaucratic aspects of the cult. Somebody had to organize annual festivals, make sure the shrine was in good order, and so forth. The rewards for this service could include civic benefits such as front seats at the theater, the right to wear special clothes, free lunch, and a fee for each sacrifice that could be paid in money, meat, or other animal parts. A text from the end of the 4th century from Miletos offers a good idea of just what was involved. He will take the skins and other prerequisites. If one animal is sacrificed, he will take the tongue, the loin with meat on it, and the oar. If more than one animal is sacrificed, he will take a loin with meat on it from each animal, the tongue, and one thigh bone with flesh on it from the lot. And the priest who serves all of the other gods in the Tamenos will take the same prerequisites and the thigh with meat on it in place of the oar if the basileus should not take it. If the polis should sacrifice a victim whose skin is singed, he will take the tongue, the loin, with meat on it and the ore. If some foreigner should wish to make a sacrifice to Apollo, whichever citizen the foreigner should choose will give all of the prerequisites which the city would give except for the skin. If any foreigner should wish to make a sacrifice at the Apollonia. Aside from the fact that no one is quite sure now what is meant by the ore, the organization here is reasonably straightforward. First and foremost, it is clear that the animals sacrificed in this cult are large, and the god shared space in his precinct with other gods who had a single priest to look after their affairs. This priest had a claim to meet if multiple offerings were made to the principal divinity, perhaps a recognition that he could expect less business and thus needed to share in that of the chief god to make his priesthood worthwhile. It appears that another priest, the Basilius, also had some claim to the animals. Direct approach to the god here seems to have been limited to citizens, a feature that is not without parallel in the case of important cults elsewhere. The multiple claims to parts of a sacrificial animal suggest that this was indeed as a significant benefit of office. In other texts, it appears that the priest was not expected to be present every time that a sacrifice was made, and then the sacrificer was supposed to leave the appropriate portion of the animal on a table where the priest could collect it. Another text from Miletos suggests that people were not always as scrupulous in the observance of this rule as they might be. A person who had failed to leave the portion of the offering due to the priestess of Artemis would be enrolled amongst the civic debtors and banned from participation in public life until appropriate recompense was made. Perhaps the most significant feature of the Miletos text is the fact that the penalties are civil. The city debt collector is the person who will collect from the defaulter. It is a civic authority that bans the defaulting sacrificer from public affairs. The sacrificer incurred no stain of miasma for the failure to pay the priest. This is the clearest possible indication that an offense against the person or income of a priest was not a de facto religious offense. The god had nothing to do with the choice of the priest/priestess. Increasingly, priesthoods were sold to the highest bidder, and the sums realized by the polis for the sale of multiple priesthoods could be substantial, leading in some cases to a secondary market in priesthoods, as a person who had purchased a priesthood for life might transfer it to another. A fascinating text from Erythrae, dating to the first part of the 3rd century BC, gives a list of priests, annual prices for priesthoods, and sales on the secondary market, which included a transfer tax to the city. If a human could not be found to hold a priesthood, it was possible through legal fiction to transfer the priesthood to the god or goddess herself. Under these circumstances, it appears that the money spent by the god to hold the priesthood was treated as a loan from the god's treasury to the city, which would have to be repaid. A vast conceptual space separated the practices connected with ritual impurity, which assumed an extraordinarily activist posture by the divinity, and the priesthood that served to manage the civic affairs of a divinity. The mundane affairs of priests should not obscure the fact that the temple was still sacred, hieros, and the belief that the divinity could be physically present in the shrine. A shrine was both a civic monument celebrating the polis's association with the divinity and a direct link with the divine plane. The negotiation of the space between the human and divine was not something that could be left to priests. This space was filled instead by a wide range of professionals whose specialty was either sacred law or direct communication with the divinity. As agents of passive religion, Greek priests were not empowered to decide either what gods were to be worshipped in a polis context or how they were to be worshipped. Their positions depended on decisions taken elsewhere. It was a god or goddess who decided to reside in a hieron, and it was a divinity who told humans how the cult should work. The perceived role of the gods in this way is so central to Greek religion that while it is possible to rationalize all of this into a series of human decisions, it would be wrong to do so. As we have seen, The fundamental worldview that informed the structure of polis cult assumed that the gods were different from the mortals. While humans might question the validity of individual cult practices within a polis, there were very few, if any, genuine agnostics in the Greek world. People knew that the gods were in contact with them because the gods spoke to them and told them how they were to be worshipped. A text that has recently come to light from Calitus contains a list of gods who are worshipped in the city and a collection of Delphic oracles listing gods who ought to be celebrated. It was also typical for an oracle establishing a new cult to decree who should participate, what should be sacrificed, and how. In the light of the content of these oracles, it is likely, though this cannot be proved on the basis of the texts themselves, that the portions of the sacred laws that are connected with ritual purity and participation go back to an oracle that had approved their content. If an oracle was not involved in the establishment of a cult, it was typical for there to be some other form of direct divine action. Thus, the soteria that was instituted at Delphi after the repulse of the Gauls in 278 is explicitly connected with the epiphany of the god during the battle and the new festival of Artemis Lycophryne at Magnesia on the Meander is said to have been the result of an epiphany of the goddess. So too, the cult of Serapis was reshaped into a national cult under the Ptolemies as the result of a vision of Ptolemy I, and the shrine of Serapis at Delphi includes a text describing the vision of Serapis to the founder of that shrine. At Epidaurus and other shrines, the miraculous cures of Asclepios proved to all who went to the temple and read the record of the god's mercy what he could do. The sudden upsurge in the inscription of these stories in the 3rd century is perhaps a response to the public stress on the manifestation of divine action in other quarters. In the course of celebrating the gods, the moment of sacrifice was a critical point where the active and passive intersected. The mode of sacrifice, the date upon which it was offered, if offered by the city, and indeed the decision by an individual to offer the sacrifice are all elements of passive religion in that they depend upon the existing expectation that contact with the god will be made in a certain way at a certain time. Participation in the sacrifice also varied depending upon who offered it. A civic sacrifice could very well involve the participation of the whole community, which might then share in a banquet. A private sacrifice would plainly involve only those persons whom the sacrificer deemed necessary. The presence of priests was always necessary at a public sacrifice, but not at a private one, a further sign of the priest's role as a representative of the community to the god, rather than of the god to the community. The moment of sacrifice, however, injected an element of the active, for the god was, in theory, invited to participate in the sacrifice, and the sacrificer attached great importance to signs that the god had accepted a sacrifice. The course of the sacrificial ceremony was centered on the decisive moment when the god's presence would be manifest. Thus, it began with the procession in which the sacrificial animal was led to the altar, and when it arrived, the participants stood in a circle, washing their hands with lustral water and taking a handful of grain. Once the humans were prepared, water was sprinkled on the head of the animal so that it would nod in agreement to its fate. In the case of an animal with hair, a lock was then cut from its forehead to be thrown onto the fire that was burning on the altar. The chief sacrificer then uttered a prayer to the god, and those who were also participants threw their handfuls of barley onto the fire. The sacrificer then cut the animal's throat, and women who accompanied the procession let out a cry. The animal was then butchered, with the god's portion being placed on the altar and the priest's prerequisites left on a table nearby. Every stage of the operation was watched closely for signs of divine approval. If there was trouble with a sacrificial animal, it was a bad sign. If fire did not flare up when the god's portion consisting of fat and bones was placed upon it, that was also a bad sign. If some fault appeared within the animal after it was sacrificed, that too was a bad sign. On the other hand, if all went well, the sacrificer could then turn to the further butchery of the animal and the preparation of the feast for those who had participated. The symbolic ordering of events makes the meaning of the ceremony very clear. The god comes first. If the human has succeeded in making positive contact with the god, then the human may participate in a meal that the divinity has agreed to join. If not, it was up to the human to figure out what went wrong, and quite possibly to do so by asking a god what the problem was with the aid of a professional consultant. Professional consultants came, broadly speaking, in two varieties: those who specialized in deductive prognostication on the basis of signs, and those who were divinely inspired. In general terms, words for inspired prophets involved compounds of words for speech: prophetes, thesipioros, kresmologos, while those for other specialists involved compounds derived from their method of divination, and oiniopolos sought meaning from the flight of birds, and astrologos from the movement of the stars, and so forth. The significant exception to this general tendency is the word mantis, connected with mainomai, to rant or rage. Even in the classical period, the word was used loosely to designate any expert, despite what would appear to be an original derivation from the practice of inspired prophecy. The mantis raged because he could not control the god who spoke through him. In some cases, their function appears to have been to suggest sacrifices that would yield accurate results, giving the mantis a reasonable claim to have offered material assistance in winning a battle. Others seem to have been less skilled and functioned simply to interpret omens for which they could take no particular credit. Certainly, when a city needed advice, standard practice appears to have been to approach an oracle rather than a local specialist. The prophets at oracles were evidently felt to be in closer touch with the divine than others. The range of professionals was vast, ranging from people who had their own predictive methods, such as interpreting cheeses, to those who were specialists in the wisdom of that appeared in books of prophecy that were the professed work of prophets who had lived in the distant past. The practice of these people, ordinarily referred to as kresmologoi, was widespread as early as the 6th century, and their impact will be felt later in this chapter when we turn to the question of discourse between Greek and non-Greek modes of religious thought. Subchapter 3: Polis Cult and Polis Dignity. The connection between cult and civic life made it inevitable that a city should attempt to promote its own cults as a form of civic aggrandizement. This was anything but new in the centuries after Alexander, as the history of Delphi or Olympia, Dodona or Delos in the classical period make abundantly clear. The Athenian use of the cult of Athena in the period of its 5th century empire was more aggressive than anything attempted by the supra-regional kingdoms after Alexander, and for obvious reasons. While the Seleucids could make much of their devotion to Apollo, or the Ptolemies of their links to Heracles and Zeus, they were perforce referring to the generalized Olympian divinity rather than any individual city cult. The one exception to this rule is a close association with the Attalids and the cult of Zeus at Pergamon, for unlike the other Hellenistic monarchies, they started from a polis base rather than a base provided by the Macedonian people in arms, and they never asserted a desire for control of the whole. The fact that the monarchs might patronize polis cults as a way of demonstrating their good qualities might have had the collateral effect of encouraging new forms of expression through which cities could assert their own importance through the promotion of their own cults. The development of the right of asylum is one of these significant changes in civic practice during the Hellenistic period, and while it was by no means universal, it was widespread enough to be seen as a characteristic of the period. This change did not involve the abandonment of earlier practices, but rather the addition of a new practice. It appears that the request for such rites did not emerge directly from temples. Rather, it stemmed from a complex of factors, not the least of them being the repulse of the Gauls from Delphi and the recollection of a tradition of pan-Hellenic success against the barbarian foes. Prior to the middle of the 3rd century, the only place in the Greek world that had been recognized in historical time as permanently sacred and inviolable was Plataea. The repulse of the Gauls was presented to the world as an event of similar magnitude to the defeat of the Persians, the language with which it was described, and a suitable miracle was reported. What is more, and this point, while not made directly by anyone, would perhaps have been made clear to everyone, it was a victory won by Greek police without the aid of a king. The temple of Athena Itonia at Koronia in Boeotia, the federal shrine of the Boeotian League, is the first temple that we know to have been the object of a decree of inviolability. Like Delphi, the shrine had historic significance, but in this case the decree may have been motivated by an actual desire to protect a place that might be threatened in the course of the Cremontian War that was raging between the Antigonids of Macedon and an alliance of Greek states led by Athens and Sparta. Although this move may have been associated with an early effort by states in mainland Greece to assert their independence, the sudden reassertion of royal power after the Antigonid victory may have suggested that the efforts at civic assertion move into a different context. Assertion of a glorious past or of miracles on another plane could offer avenues without challenging the power of the kings, now shown to be a fruitless activity. At the same time, there seems to have been an increase in the number of cities that were seeking pan-Hellenic status for themselves through the foundation of new games. Requests for the status of sacred and inviolable are often found in the context of these new games as a request for other forms of civic embellishment. Thus, on an inscription from Lebedia, we find that Calliclidas, the Locrian from Opus, having gone down to the oracle of Trophonios, announced that Lebedia is to be dedicated to Zeus Basilius and Trophonios, and Agraphia to Apollo Toios, and no one is to wrong these peoples. They are both to collect sacred funds for the common good in every land and proclaim the holy contest. Whoever repairs the temple of Zeus Basilius will wear the crown. It would perhaps be easy to read this text as a sign that divine cult had become a ritualized farce in the struggle for civic improvement. So too might it be possible to read the decree of the people of Magnesia on the Meander, proclaiming their festival of Artemis Lycophrini as a blatant attempt to gain status on the basis of claims about a divine apparition. Likewise, in reading replies such as those of Ptolemy to the people of Kos as a publicity stunt, motivated by the desire to be seen to be as reasonable as others, for he states that the fact that others have recognized their festival in honor of Asclepios is a factor in motivating his acceptance. But in all these cases, there is a consistent pattern. What is needed first and foremost is a sign of divine will, either in the form of a specific intervention or in other cases because success can be attributed to the long-standing favor of the divinity who is to be celebrated. The crucial point is that a convincing case needed to be presented that the divinity had taken the initiative. Instead of seeing these actions as a sign that local cults had lost their meaning, it is perhaps better to see them as reinforcing the importance of local cults in civic life. A phenomenon that runs parallel to the search for asylum is the use of history to negotiate with other states. In this case, of course, there was a long tradition of mythological diplomacy and the creation of fictive kinship in Greek history. But that does not make the phenomenon, which increased dramatically in the centuries after Alexander, any less significant. The stories of gods and heroes provided the ideological glue that held the Greek world together. While not strictly speaking religious, neither is this form of discourse, strictly speaking, secular? It represents the close linkage of local cult and local identity. The use of stories about gods and heroes as icebreakers between two states is very similar to the use of miracle stories to justify claims for sacred and inviolable status. Although in the modern world these accounts may be viewed as constructed history, there is no proof that they were conceived of this way in the ancient. In a sense, the discourse of miracle and myth contextualized current concerns within a greater world history. Subchapter 4: Cult for Humans. One aspect of the discourse of myth and miracle was the fact that mortals had become gods in the Greek tradition long before the time of Alexander. So too, temples were repositories of items that were of importance to a city. The two traditions are of equal importance in explaining how it was that there was a rapid increase in the number of people who received divine honors after the death of Alexander. This is a phenomenon that, strictly speaking, should not be referred to as a ruler cult. As we shall see, people who were never in a position to claim the title of Basileus received such honors, and the practice of granting such honors to kings emerges from a context in which individuals of all sorts were acquiring honors in a divine context. The dividing line between the placement of an image of a human being in a temple and celebrating a festival in honor of a person whose image has been erected in a temple is not nearly as vast as the gulf between human and divine. What it reflects is a melding of civic interest and divine location in a new way rather than an altogether new phenomenon. The crucial point for understanding the development of divine cult for humans is that by the second half of the 4th century, it was not unusual for honors that a city had voted to an individual to be inscribed on a stele that was placed within a temple precinct. Thus, at some point between 334 and 332, the people of Delphi ordered that a decree for the historian Callisthenes and the philosopher Aristotle be placed in the temple of Apollo at Delphi. In 333, the people of Priene ordered that a statue of Mexibaxos or Mezibazos, the Ephesian, be placed in their temple of Athena. In 334, the people of Erythrae ordered that stele commemorating the actions of their citizen Phanes, who had played a role in expelling the Persians from the city, be placed in the temples of Athena and Heracles. In 332/331, the Athenians ordered that a stone stele honoring the historian Phonodemos for his service to Amphiaraus be placed in the temple itself. In 328/327, they ordered the similar honors for Androcles, the priest of Asclepios in the temple of the god he had served. At Samos, the citizens of the restored polis honored a certain Gorgo, who had played some role in negotiating the removal of the Athenian colony with Alexander, and inscribed the decree on a stele that was erected in the temple of Hera. The Athenians had not left peacefully after Alexander's decree, and had arrested a group of Samians that had attempted to return, transporting them to Athens, where they were sentenced to death. A man named Anteleon from Chalkis on Euboea intervened to save them from their fate. In his case, the Samians voted that Anteleon should receive a statue of bronze in the temple of Hera, as well as a variety of other honors. The practice of dedicating statues or other images in temples for individuals who had merely spent a great deal of money or time on some temple or other civic matter raised the question of what to do for someone whose ability to act went far beyond that of the ordinary civic benefactor. The fusion of honors in the civic context brings out the ease with which an ancient could put what we call human honors and what we should call divine honors on a level without an inevitable mental confusion between the objects of each or the categories to which those objects belonged. As we have seen, it was a city that determined what gods should be worshipped and how. The honors were the city's to bestow. It was on Samos, in the wake of Lysandros' defeat of Athens, that cult honors were first offered to a living man. Lysandros' restoration of Samos went far beyond what an ordinary benefactor could offer, so it may have made sense to honor him in a way that no other man was honored. So too at Syracuse in 357 there is evidence that an altar was erected in honor of Dion after he had ended the tyranny. There is no need to think that this decision was taken because of what the Samians had done earlier. Lysandros had, after all, come to a bad end. Rather, it is likely that the Syracusans were independently motivated by the same logic. He had done something extraordinary and so deserved an extraordinary honor. In Macedonia, a cult appears to have been established for Amnitas, possibly in his own lifetime at Pydna, and the same was almost certainly done for Philip at Amphipolis. Somewhat later, as his armies marched through western Asia Minor, taking advantage of underprepared Persian defenses, Philip received divine honors at Erissos and Ephesus. Philip himself appears to have taken all this one step further when he appeared as a 13th god in a procession at Pella on the last day of his life. He was, after all, a benefactor to the Greek world, unlike any other man, and so he integrated himself into a local form of celebration in his capital. Given the honors for Philip, it is scarcely surprising that Alexander first received cults from the cities of Asia Minor, and then, it appears, promoted suggestions of his own divinity after his visit to Siva. Despite the special claims that they may both have had and sought to promote, Philip and Alexander did not remove divine honors from a civic context. Two decrees are of great significance for understanding the spread of divine honors for mortals after the death of Alexander. The first of these decrees concerns a man named Thersippos in the small island polis of Naissos, who obtained significant influence with various Macedonian generals after Alexander's death. Here the statement with regard to divine honors is explicit, for the people will crown him on 3 successive days and offer a eugelia and a soteria and a panegyris at public expense. The second, known only through a much later honorific decree from Colophon, refers to a temple called the Prepeleion. The Prepeleion honored a general of Lysimachos who had arranged for the city to be preserved when the king had desired to transfer its population in its entirety to Ephesus. Cult to the benefactors, either as individuals or as a group, continued for the next several centuries. Thus, in 117, a decree of the Macedonian city of Latai in honor of a Roman quaestor named Marcus Annio states that the citizens will establish a contest involving horse races in his honor each year in the month of Dionysios, when they celebrate the contest in honor of the other benefactors. At Athens, the Ephebius were charged in the late 2nd century with offering the established sacrifices to the gods and the benefactors, and the gymnasiarch at Pergamon was ordered to make the proper sacrifices to the gods in the gymnasium and to the other benefactors. The language used in these and other cases reveals that the cult of the benefactors was closely linked with other celebrations of the past. Thus, in addition to participating in festivals such as the Dionysia and the Lucinian mysteries, the Athenian ephebes would appear at sacrifices at the Iantia on Salamis, making an offering to Zeus Tropeos, offer sacrifice at the public tomb at Marathon, and appear in the procession of Artemis Agortera, all festivals connected with the Persian wars of the 5th century. Likewise, they would go and inquire about the proprietary rights of Athens at the Amphiaraon, acquired in 287 as a way of asserting Athenian ownership. Benefactors and old battles were part and parcel of a civic tradition. Similar to the cult of benefactors who were alive was the establishment of hero cults to those who had died. The The category of hero or demigod, a category that occupied an area between the mortal and divine realms, was a peculiarly Greek institution. In outward form, it involved the creation of a special grave, a heroon, that was separated from other graves, the offering of regular sacrifice and votive gifts, and sometimes a spectacular monument. The rites with which heroes were celebrated were to some degree a chthonic counterpart to the rites with which the gods were celebrated, involving blood sacrifice, offerings of food, and libations. Some sites appear to have made provision for bathing and lamentation for the dead hero appears to have been routine. The sacrifice was always accompanied by a banquet at which the hero was thought to be present, and in some cases by a festival that was equal to that offered to a god. In other cases, the celebration was less spectacular, and the accomplishment that qualified a person for heroic status was allegedly no more than having died. Why don't you hang yourself and become a hero in Thebes? Thebes appears in an Attic comedy and might be best rendered in English as drop dead. One of the crucial aspects of the hero or heroine was that he or she only lived once and thus could have one true resting place. This led to a significant connection between hero cult and community identity. If all places might have a Zeus, only one place could be the resting place of Achilles' son, Pyrrhus, whose tomb was at Delphi. The connection between community history and hero cult would appear to go back to the formative period of the practice, and it may be no accident that it was connected with the epic cycle as a feature of the archaic reification of tradition. In some cases, actual sites were connected with the Mycenaean past. The graves of the Hyperborean maidens on Delos are the remains of Mycenaean tombs, and it may be that the epic tradition itself helped shape this formation of commemoration. As the epic cycle gave shape to Greek notions of their past, hero cult enabled Greeks of later generations to lay claim to a piece of that tradition. Hero cult plainly had a strong political aspect from the 6th century onwards, when Athenians laid claim to Salamis on the basis of Homer, and Sparta to a dominant position within the Peloponnese on the basis of the Achaean tradition invented around the bones of Orestes. The strength of these traditions as part of a national myth during the Hellenistic period may be seen, for instance, in the actions of the Athenian ephebes described above, and their visit to a pair of hero shrines, those of Ajax and Amphiaraus, in the course of their annual peregrinations, and their participation in the Thesia, the festival celebrating the role of Theseus in the foundation of the Attic state. As historical figures, heroes were no more figures of the distant past than were other benefactors, and the tradition of celebrating benefactors as heroes is important as a later development in the cult of benefactors. It was a basic premise of benefactor cult that the benefactor who received the honors was still alive, while it was a basic premise of a hero cult that the honorand was deceased. Benefactor cult and the extension of benefactor cult to hero cult may be seen as logical developments of existing polis institutions, and extensions that might have taken place even if Philip or Alexander had never lived. Cult had, after all, been offered to Lysandros in the wake of his destruction of Athenian power in 404. In a sense, it is important to keep benefactor cult within the civic context, separate from the ruler cult, an extension of benefactor cult that moved in a wholly new direction, and the subject of next chapter of this book. For present purposes, however, it will be sufficient to note that the one of the truly interesting features of this phenomenon was the way that it facilitated the redefinition of Greek traditions within native contexts in the realm of the Ptolemies, where it developed. What evolved in Egypt was a combination of elements derived from benefactor cult with indigenous traditions to create a new form of discourse that proved remarkably powerful as a political institution, providing the structures upon which the later Roman imperial cult would evolve. It also offers a paradigm for the differential integration of new religious forms of discourse that had multiple meanings depending upon the perspective of the participant in the discourse, and it is to this broader context that we must now turn. Subchapter 5: Interactions. The interchange between Greek and non-Greek traditions of religious thought is by far the most important feature of the Hellenistic period from the perspective of the broader history of religious thought. As we shall see, there was no one model that fits all forms of contact, and one world will be avoided in the description of any of them. This word is syncretism, a word in religious studies describes the influence of one religion upon another, but the forms of this interaction are so varied as to make the term virtually meaningless. Instead of saying that some behavior is the result of syncretistic synthesis or syncretistic evolution, it is perhaps better to be content with terms like synthesis, symbiosis, acculturation, transformation, distortion, absorption. It is perhaps more useful to examine parallelism, interaction, and identification, all of which have been identified as different forms of syncretism in their own right rather than as features of something else. In speaking of the evolution of ideas about the gods, it might be better to think of confrontation as theocracy. All of these phenomena are amply attested in the record of religious interaction between Greek and non-Greek in the centuries after Alexander. It is from the very limit of Greek rule in Central Asia that some of the most intriguing evidence for synthesis comes. The excavations at Ai-Khanum on the Oxus in modern Afghanistan did not reveal the foundations of a Greek temple before the political crises of recent years forced their termination. But they did reveal the foundations of a Mesopotamian-style house, the Temple of the Niches, on the main street of the town, containing what appears to be a colossal statue of a seated Zeus, along with a variety of other dedications. An inscription that dates to the middle of the 2nd century BC reveals that the gods of the gymnasium were still being worshipped at that point. Inscriptions from the treasury show officials with both Greek and Persian names working side by side in the administration. The coins of the Bactrian kings were replete with images of the gods of the Aegean, and it appears that they claimed a particular affinity to Zeus. Plutarch claimed that the people of Bactria learned to honor the Greek gods after Alexander, and the evidence cited above may be taken as proving his point, but only on a most superficial level. Thus, the Artemis who was also worshipped at Ai-Khanum, giving her name to the current site, seems to have been Lady Moon in the local dialect. Her cult was assimilated to that of the Mesopotamian goddess Anahita, and, as the modern tradition suggests, both divinities may have resonated with the worship of a goddess prior to the arrival of the Achaemenids. So too, while the Temple of the Niches contains the aforementioned statue of Zeus, it also contains an image of Kybele, and numerous objects that look back beyond the Achaemenid era to older kingdoms such as Urartu and Assyria. The best explanation of the miscellany that has emerged from the study of objects found in niches is that they are connected with the worship of a divinity or divinities by the indigenous people. The collocation of objects in the temple of the niches, assembled between 280 and 150, is of particular interest, as the temple appears to have ceased to function as a temple in the late period of the habitation of the site, the period after the end of direct Greek control. The temple's fate seemed to suggest that it was seen as a building connected to some significant way to the previous regime, which was evidently loathed by the nomadic Yuchi, who sacked the city in 145. If that is the case, then the temple may well represent not so much the coexistence between the Greek and indigenous cults as it did the gradual ascent of an indigenous cult so that it became a cult of the ruling power. This in turn may help confirm what would otherwise seem the obvious conclusion to draw from an altar dedicated in Greek at Taht-i-Sangin by a man named Arthrosokis to Oxus. In this case, of course, we have a man with a Persian name making a dedication to a Central Asian god in the language that he had assimilated from the ruling class. The temple in which he made his dedication was, like the temple of the niches at Ai-Khanum, in the Mesopotamian style. The system was thus neither Greek nor truly that of the original system of the indigenous people, but rather a blending of three different systems: Greek, Persian, and Central Asian. If in the later period of the Bactrian kingdom local cults were becoming significant for the ruling class, it should also be noted that in the earlier period of the kingdom, the flow of influence was set in the opposite direction. The front of the Hirun of Kinias at Ai-Khanum was originally marked by three columns containing the 150 or so sayings of the seven sages, carefully copied by the peripatetic philosopher Clearchus from Delphi and inscribed at what was the furthest point in the Greek world. About 20 years later, on the borders of Marian kingdom of Asoka, a number of pillars were erected in a variety of languages to inform the king's subjects of his personal moral code. One of these, erected in the 10th century of his reign, was placed in the city of Kandahar, known to the Greek world as Alexandria in Arcosia, inscribed in both Greek and Aramaic. The Greek version reads as follows: 10 years having passed, King Pyodases revealed piety to men. Thenceforth he made men more pious and made all things prosper throughout the entire land. The king abstained from eating living creatures, and following his example, other men did likewise. And all who were hunters or fishermen have ceased their work. Those lacking self-control have, as far as possible, overcome their weakness, and unlike before, have become obedient to their father, mother, and elders. By doing these things, they will live more profitably in the future. The Greek phrasing of this text reveals many close points of contact with the Delphic maxims, and there is direct evidence for Greek philosophers who had visited the court of the Marian kings. The Diamachos, who negotiated the treaty between Seleucus I and Asoka's father Bindusara, appears to have been the author of a work on piety, Eusebeias in Greek, but in the text presented here, the word Eusbeia translates precisely the word Dhamma. Whether or not Diamachos' work was composed before, during, or after his stay in the court of Bindusara does not really matter, for it is clear from other evidence that the ideas that he espoused were in general terms of interest. Ptolemy II was sufficiently aware of this to make sure that he included a philosopher in the embassy that he sent to the same court. Asoka himself sought to continue the dialogue on his own account by sending Brahmins to discuss matters with the Greeks. This may reasonably be taken as an example of constructive discourse between two different modes of thought. But does it mean that Asoka's thought was conditioned or altered in some significant way by the encounter with Greek philosophy? The evidence can be read in two very different ways. According to one reading, the verbal parallels between Asoka's Greek text and the language of the Delphi maxims suggest that there was a very real influence. Another reading, when Asoka's Greek text is read in the context of his other edicts might suggest something very different, that Asoka had a scribe who was familiar with the seven sages and used the language of the text as a guide to translating Asoka's thought into Greek. In the second view, if the second view is accepted, then there is a very interesting parallelism between the Indian and Greek behaviors towards each other. Ahsoka's interest in Greek philosophy may be seen as a vehicle for communication with his subjects rather than as a profound intellectual engagement. He is using Greek to express Indian thought. At the same time, Greeks may be seen transforming Indian culture into something that was comprehensible to themselves. To the very Clearchos who brought Delphic maxims to Ai Khanum are attributed two remarks of staggeringly blinkered religious ethnography. According to Diogenes of Laertius, he declared that the naked sophists were the descendants of the Magi. He also appears to have maintained that all opinions concerning nature could be found to originate among philosophers outside of Greece, some amongst the Brahmins of India, others in Syria, among those who are called the Jews. Indeed, he appears to have argued that the Jews were actually descendants of the Brahmins. Whatever he was actually told, Clearchus plainly only heard it according to his own preconceived notions of the way that knowledge was transmitted from one culture to another. The case of Clearchus' encounter with the wise men of the East may reasonably be compared with the fate of one man who did try to explain an Eastern religion in its own terms and in Greek. The man in question is Berossos, who was connected in some way with the cult of Marduk at Babylon, and who composed a history probably entitled the Babylonica to demonstrate the importance of Babylon in the history of the Near East. In this history, he plainly drew up texts in his native language, and he seems to have tried to present this material in a way that conformed to the tastes of his rulers. He failed, quite possibly because his version of Babylonian history and religion was so completely at odds with the version of Near Eastern history and religion that the people he was trying to educate already knew. There was no room in the Greek version of the Near East for a Babylon that was distinct from Assyria and Persia. Nor, it seems, was there room for a religious system that did not involve the Magi. Berossus' history seems to have attracted relatively little notice until the 1st century BC, when the historian Alexander Polyhistor produced a condensed version of it. After that, it seems to have been ignored, save by the authors of other specialized tracts on Babylonian history and commentators in Greek or on Hebrew scripture. As if to complete the act of cultural appropriation, Berossus himself was transformed within the Greek tradition from a real being to an object of fiction. Vitruvius wrote that Berossus was the first of the Chaldeans who were versed in the astrology to come west, and that he settled on Kos. A number of other Western authors cite his alleged doctrines with approval, and the elder Pliny even records that there was a statue of him in the gymnasium at Athens with a golden tongue erected because of his divine predictions. The astrological doctrines associated with his name, however, are all Greek. In another tradition, he becomes the father of a Sibyl who was said to have lived in the very earliest period of human history. Appropriation may also result in parallelism, or at best a one-directional flow of intellectual influence. The Seleucids regarded indigenous temples as sacred places. But with the exception of Seleucus the first's patronage of the temple of Marduk at Babylon, they also paid them little heed, preferring to found temples to Greek gods in their new cities and allowing traditional cults to continue without interruption. Two sites in particular reveal possible models of interaction quite different from each other, albeit contemporaneous. These are Masjid-e-Soleiman and Bard-e-Nekhande, both in the southeastern part of Iran that had once comprised the ancient kingdom of Elam and the homeland of the Achaemenids, and would, before the end of the Hellenistic period, house the kingdom of Elymais. Nekhande was constructed in the 2nd century BC by the Elamite king Kamniskides the first in the form of a traditional Zoroastrian shrine with three basic elements: a terrace that supported a podium upon which sat an attestga, the high tower that housed in a chamber at the top a sacred fire. As the excavator notes, the shrine was constructed as if the Greeks had never been. Masjid-e-Sulayman, by way of contrast, shows some signs of contact with the Greek world. The original shrine with its terrace podium, a testga structure, dates to the early Achaemenid period, and in this context, two votive objects of extreme antiquity have been discovered, one being an Assyrian cylinder containing a treaty between Esarhaddon and the Medes, the other being a casket of Thutmose III. In the course of the late 3rd or early 2nd century BC, the terrace was expanded to the north and west to hold two new temples which had been identified as being to Athena, Hippia, the other to Heracles, probably dating to the reign of Antiochus III. In either case, did the temple resemble a temple of the Aegean world? In both cases, the style of construction resembles the style of In neither case did the temple resemble a temple of the Aegean world. In both cases, the style of construction resembles that of the Seleucid Empire at Uruk, modeled on Mesopotamian structures. In other words, if these are Greek cults, they are Greek cults in thoroughly non-Greek buildings. The three temples appear to have coexisted throughout the Seleucid period as independent entities, a true parallelism. The lack of local respect for the Greek tradition amongst the indigenous population may be reflected by the fact that the Temple of Athena was sacked in the course of the Parthian conquest, and both temples were rededicated to Parthian divinities, Anahita and Varithragna. Aside from the shape of the building in which they were worshipped, there is no evidence to suggest that Persian attitudes affected the way that the Greek colonists viewed their gods. On the other hand, when the shrine of Heracles became unquestionably one of Varithragna, his worshippers recognized him in an anthropomorphic form. This was a very real departure from earlier traditions, a sign that temple architecture can only take us so far in determining what people thought about the gods who were worshipped within their walls. It is quite reasonable to think that architecture was more conservative than theology. In the realm of theology, the anthropomorphization of Persian gods may be paralleled by at least one significant development in Zoroastrian thought. This development is the view that history can be described as a succession of kingdoms followed by an eschatological catastrophe. This scheme is attested in a 13th century AD Persian manuscript, but in such a way as to make it clear that it had entered Zoroastrian thinking in the early Hellenistic period. From there it appears to have entered Jewish thought, where it is adumbrated most famously in the book of Daniel. In Greek thought, the scheme, which has its origins in the Hesiodic myth of Aegis, became so well established that uses of the pattern were not always eschatological. Dionysius of Halicarnassos exploited the notion as a way of praising Rome in the preface to his Roman Antiquities, pointing out that Rome was superior to the four previous kingdoms, and another Augustan historian, Pompeius Trogus, adopted it to give structure to his universal history. In the 2nd century, Appian used it in the preface to his collected histories of Rome and of Rome's wars and civil wars in a way that was very similar to Dionysius. The contact between Greek and Iranian, Indian, and Central Asian systems of thought thus allowed for a wide range of different results, though in the main Greek ideas were adapted to indigenous systems of thought in ways that were largely consistent with their own traditions. And as far as the Greeks went, it would appear that their habits may have assimilated more in the direction of Eastern thought than Eastern traditions assimilated themselves to the Greek. Perhaps the most striking example of this was the ultimate conversion of the Greek kings who established themselves in the Indus Valley at the end of the 2nd century to Buddhism. A rather different set of results obtained farther west, where polis traditions were much stronger in the case of various divinities that were native to Anatolia, though even here, earlier ideas about the relationship between mortal and immortal are detectable. Perhaps as a result of the vast distances involved and the relatively small number of Greeks, the interactions between the peoples in Central Asia and Iran had no significant impact upon the Mediterranean world. It is Asoka who tells us of the missionaries he sent to the kingdoms of the West. No Greek sources report them. Indeed, after Seleucus I's vigorous interventions in Central Asia, it would appear that Seleucid kings lost interest in the area, which may account for the relatively rapid rise of independent states there in the course of the 3rd century. In the course of the 3rd century BC, which may help explain the increasing openness of Greeks to indigenous ideas. The same cannot be said of developments further to the west. There were two basic models of interaction between Greek thought and those of Anatolia and Syria. One resulted in the alteration of a Greek god into a form of a Greek divinity, usually retaining the original identity in the form of a specific cult title, for example, Zeus Amphiletes. The other was the adaptation of the divinity under its own name into a Greek context. Three cults, those of Kybele, Atartagus, and the Jewish god Yahweh, may offer useful insight into the latter process. They are, in certain institutional ways, quite similar. All three had a single primary cult center, Pessinus in Galatia for Kybele, Hierapolis in Syria for Atartagus, and Jerusalem for Yahweh. In the cases of Yahweh and Atartagus, we know that the temple cults were governed by elaborate rules of procedure before the time of Alexander. Likewise, in the cases of Yahweh and Atartagus, there was also a pronounced henotheistic element, meaning that the divinity in question was thought to be the greatest by his or her followers. We know somewhat less about the cult of Kybele, but it is clear that like Atartagus, she was originally a divinity connected with fertility, while Yahweh had affinities with the widespread Aramaic cult of Hadad. What is, however, most significant about all three is that they resisted ready assimilation to any Olympian divinity. Their followers created communities in Greek cities, made offerings in Greek, but they also appear to have retained the essential integrity of their practice. As we saw with Asoka, the use of Greek as a vehicle for expression does not mean that the cult was Hellenized in the sense that it was transformed by Greek ideas. Rather, the use of Greek made it possible to communicate with people beyond the homeland more freely. The cult centers of Atartagus at Hierapolis, of Kybele at Pessinus, and of Yahweh at Jerusalem were essentially temple states in that primary temporal and religious authority resided with the high priest. The essential elements of such states are spelled out in a quite detailed fashion by Strabo in his description of another temple state, that of the goddess Ma. In this anti-Taros are deep and narrow valleys in which are situated Comana and the temple of Enyo, whom people there call Ma. It is a considerable city. Its inhabitants, however, consist mostly of divinely inspired people and the sacred slaves who live in it. Its inhabitants are Carataonians, who, though in a general way classified as subjects of the king, are in most respects subject to the priest. The priest is a master of the temple and also of the sacred slaves, who, on my sojourn there, were more than 6,000 in number, both men and women together. Also, considerable territory belongs to the temple, and the revenue is enjoyed by the priest. he is second in rank in Cappadocia after the king. While the study of temple states may belong more properly to an account of Hellenistic land tenure rather than one of religion, the very existence of such states raises significant issues for the history of religion. Chief among these is the relationship between the priest in the governing temple and votaries outside the immediate territory of the temple state. There appear to have been no hard and fast rules here. We know, for instance, that when a cult image of Cybele was brought to Rome from its original home at Pessinus in 203, an official cult was established that bore no resemblance to practices in Asia Minor. Indeed, the Roman state accommodated two quite different styles of worship for the goddess, the second form being modeled on procedures in Asia Minor. What we do not know is what impact the removal of the goddess had on the celebration of her cult at home. So too it is clear that the many Jewish communities around the Mediterranean and throughout the Near East retained a formal connection with the temple of Yahweh at Jerusalem, as signified above all else by the annual tax that was paid each year to the high priest. Similarly, the priests who proclaimed the glories of a Tart goddess around the Mediterranean world were, in theory at least, to bring the money they collected for the goddess back to her shrine at Hierapolis. The tale of Eastern divinities could be vastly expanded, and to be sure, the cults of Isis, and Serapis offer significant parallels to those of Yahweh and Atartagus, especially the cult of Isis, where a basic text, the so-called Aritology of Isis, was transmitted from the central temple in Egypt. Like the later translations of Jewish scripture into Greek, the Aritology of Isis appears to have retained the sense of the original text, although it appears to have been more open to the influence of Greek thought than were Jewish texts. Indeed, the cult of Isis remained as recognizably an Egyptian cult as the cult of Yahweh remained a recognizably Palestinian one, just as the cult of Hadad, even if celebrated at Delos, remained recognizably Syrian. The fact that each cult adapted differently in the Greek environment is a sign of the degree of adaptation that the degree of adaptation was conditioned by the indigenous worshippers. The lack of significant evidence for these cults in the Aegean world prior to Alexander's conquests, especially given the significant increase in evidence for these cults in the next century, should not be seen as representing some profound shift in religiosity. Rather, it is evidence for a profound shift in political culture resulting from the demise of the Persian Empire. The devotees of Phoenician, Egyptian, and Syrian cults were coming into the Aegean, if not in greater numbers, then at least with greater confidence in the advertisement of their faith. Perhaps, too, with the removal of Persian domination, the Greek cities of the Aegean world were not only more interesting, but also more welcoming to outsiders who might no longer be seen as representatives of a power that threatened the lifestyle of the polis. Furthermore, the great stress that Ptolemaic or Seleucid kings laid upon their relationship with Greek cities may have drawn the attention of other peoples who might previously have been less interested to those places. The Greek polis had always, of course, had the capacity to welcome new gods. In the years after Alexander, they welcomed more than they had before, but it would be wrong to assume that this represented any significant new spirituality. Cults from Syria and Egypt did attract worshippers from traditional polis, but this should be taken as a sign of the vitality of traditional polis religion. Athens or Delos could provide space for an Isis, Serapis, or Hadad. Subchapter 6, Oracles. This chapter has so far stressed institutional aspects of religion as being most readily traceable across the vast spectrum of the Hellenistic world. There is, however, an equally significant area of religious activity that has not only been touched upon in passing, but where the exchange of ideas between systems of religious thought may have been even more powerful than on the institutional level. This area is the realm of the individual professional. This realm is the realm of the individual professional, of the magician, the astrologer, the prophet, and the Kresmolgos. These practitioners are fundamentally the agents of active religious activity in that they sought direct divine information for those who consulted them or provided information about the gods that was simply not available through the mechanisms of public cult. Their qualifications were determined by the results that they obtained rather than through any hard and fast rules as to what constitute licit and illicit activity. Magicians performed valuable services for the individual in need, be it in finding a missing slave, a lover, or a change in the weather. They were threatening figures in that they might be able to channel the power of a god to do some actual harm to one person while helping another. A person who wished to ensure that he would win an athletic contest might seek a spell that would weaken an opponent. A man who had been rejected by a lover might seek a spell to compel the object of his affections to accept him. If one person hated another, he might seek a spell that would incapacitate his enemy or ruin his crops. So too, a person who was uncertain about the future might consult a prophet or an astrologer about some business activity, the advisability of a journey, or a question of personal health in the same way that a city would seek the advice of the gods about these same matters. On the other hand, the same person might be seeking information that would work to the disadvantage of another. If you knew that your neighbor was going to die, why not break your agreement with him? From a very early period, states legislated against efforts to channel divine energy to the heart of another, while allowing practitioners to function freely if they did not do such things. The search for ways to compel divine power to work for private individuals led to an interest in what was perceived as Eastern wisdom. It appears to have been generally agreed in the classical period that various Eastern peoples, especially the Persians and the Egyptians, had special knowledge of the divine. After the ruin of the Persian Empire, the search for Eastern wisdom picked up pace, sometimes actually involving the integration of genuine Eastern traditions into existing practice. There is some evidence for Babylonian calculations being used by Greek astrologers and other evidence for people seeking to meet the religious professionals of Eastern cultures. In time, this would impact on local traditions, especially in Egypt, where temple officials would know what Greeks were looking for and provide improved versions of local wisdom that conformed with Greek expectations. It might also lead to the translation of actual books of native lore into Greek. Perhaps the best example of this in the Egyptian context is offered by a book known as the Oracle of the Potter. It appears that the Oracle of the Potter was originally composed in the first part of the 3rd century BC in Demotic as a piece of local propaganda directed against the Ptolemies. Two of our extant versions seem to have been rewritten at the end of the 2nd century after the failure of a rebellion led by a man named Harsiasis. In this version, the redactor tried to associate the text with an oracle of Ammon that made reference to a king of 2 years in effort to reconcile a situation that predicted by the potter with events occurring in his own time. Another redactor seems to have quoted the passage in the Lamb of Boccharis that reads, "The one of 2 who is not our king, the one of 55 is our king," in order to correct the first interpretation. Since Harsias' rebellion had lasted only 2 years, the second author may be commenting on Harsias' failure by pointing out that he cannot have been the savior of Egypt predicted in oracles, and commenting also on the possibility that King Ptolemy Euergetes II, who may have been looked upon as that savior by some when he reached the 54th year of his reign in 116 BC, was not the right one either. The Oracle of the Potter thus shows how wisdom could pass from an Egyptian context to a Greek context outside the avenues of cult. It also shows how people would use these texts as guides to the world around them and how religious language substituted for plain speaking. As we saw in the case of mythological diplomacy, one value of appealing through the ancestors, heroes, gods, and other myths was that it provided an authority to a case that present circumstances might not otherwise justify. Oracular language was, by definition, the language of the gods themselves. It carried with it an authority derived from its divine origin that ordinary readings of events lacked. By removing contemporary events from their temporal context and placing them in a deeper world historical scheme, oracles validated the desires of their readers and enabled their authors to achieve some distance from the partisan realities of present circumstance. It is thus often to oracular literature that we must turn to gain a perspective removed from the rhetoric of current circumstance. The Book of Daniel, for instance, elevated the struggle of the Maccabean rebels against the Seleucids from a struggle over control of the temple and an internal dispute over the way that Yahweh ought to be venerated, by placing it within a universal scheme of world history. The struggle of the Jewish people for their distinctive ethnic identity lay in the construction of history that allowed Daniel to overcome persecution and win regard from the great powers of the earth through Yahweh's revelations. As we now know, thanks to the discoveries at Qumran, there were earlier versions of parts of the book of Daniel that were reused and updated in the composition of the new text. As the Qumran texts now show, prophetic texts and their interpretation could help validate the claims of groups within Judaism to the propriety of their version of history. One power that recognized the authority of the Maccabean dynasty at an early date was Rome. Rome's place in the Hellenistic world was likewise a subject of oracular prediction in both supportive and hostile ways. The oracle that welcomed Scipio's army to the Hellespont in the campaign against Antiochus III was most likely composed somewhere in the Troad as a way of contextualizing the rise of the new power, just as the Trojan myth had been used to establish links between the cities of the Aegean world and the great power to the west. So too would oracles be used to establish the credentials of Rome's foes. Posidonios notes that the oracles that were recited throughout the East in support of Mithridates' first invasion of the province of Asia, and it is no doubt to the context that an extraordinary account of anti-Roman oracles preserved in the 2nd century AD as an antiquarian curiosity by Phlegon of Tralles, a freedman of the Emperor Hadrian, also belongs. The story opens after Antiochus's defeat at Thermopylae, when Bouplagos, an officer of Antiochus who had been killed, rose from the dead on the day following the battle and walked into the Roman camp, where he delivered a prophecy in a soft voice to the effect that Zeus would send a mighty race against Italy and put an end to the rule of the Romans. He then dropped dead again. The Romans, who were understandably upset by this turn of events, sent ambassadors to Delphi, where the Pythia told them to cease their invasion on the spot and return home, for Athena was preparing a powerful army that would destroy their kind. After receiving the Delphic oracle, the Romans were withdrawing towards Naupactos, when an officer named Publius fell into a prophetic fit and predicted that the Romans would suffer disaster on their way home from the conquest of Asia. When asked to explain what this meant, Publius described in reasonable detail what would occur during the rest of the war with Antiochus. He also observed that the returning army would be attacked by Thracians and lose some of its booty. He then fell into another prophetic fit, foreseeing, among other things, the destruction of Rome at the hands of an invading army and his own consumption by a wolf to prove that he had spoken the truth. The wolf duly arrived and ate Publius, leaving only the head, which once again burst into prophetic song, telling the Romans that Athena hated them and that she would send a powerful army from Asia which would destroy Italy and drag its people off into slavery. The account ends with a statement that hearing these words, they were deeply upset and established a temple and altar of Apollo Lycos where the head had lain and got onto their ships, and each one went to his own land. All the things that Publius predicted have come true. Not only does this story allow for multiple interpretations, it could be read as a tale of Sulla as easily as of Mithridates. It also validates the importance of Delphi as a source of true wisdom in the new world of Rome. It is precisely this sort of flexibility that enabled oracular literature to meditate between traditions in a way that was not possible for traditional polis cult. Polis cult might represent tradition, and as such it was invaluable, but in an ever-changing world, it was to oracles that people might turn in order to understand how their past would survive. Subchapter 7. Conclusions. There are of necessity multiple avenues of approach to Hellenistic religion. Religion in antiquity was in many ways a metaphor for power, both that of nature, which could not be controlled, and that of mortals, for which it offered a vehicle of expression. The study of religious institutions will often tell a quite different story than the study of individual behaviors, and that is as it should be. As the foundation for the passive aspect of religion, that aspect that served as a stabilizing force within institutions remained static. If 7 Athenians had gone asleep in a cave on Hymettos in 336 to awaken in 100 BC, they would not have been greatly confused by the religious structures that they confronted. Athena Polias was still in charge. The Eleusinian mysteries were still revered. Great festivals of the past still would run their course through the city. They might well wonder where some strange new gods had come from, but they would know that the polis had a way of incorporating new cults that was long sanctioned by tradition. They might be a bit taken aback by festivals for kings who had received divine honors, but they might also recall that the city had come close enough to creating such honors before they had gone to their long nap. What would astonish them, however, would be a trip through the lands of the collapsing Seleucid or Ptolemaic kingdoms. It is outside the structure of traditional polis cult that religious life was changing and had changed. The interaction between Greek and non-Greek cults was, of course, not new. What was different was the vitality of the discourse, and this is what should be meant by terms such as Hellenization and syncretism. Neither is much used in describing an end result, but as terms that may describe discourse between different groups that have genuine value, for they presume a process through which ideas are exchanged, new habits formed, and old certainties questioned. It is a tension between the stability of institutions like polis cult and the creation of new institutions, the dialogue between groups, that reflects the intimate connection between temporal and divine power in the ancient world.